Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome back to AJ108 Criminal Investigation. My name is Tony Farrar, and of course, I am your instructor for this semester. This week's lecture is going to cover Chapter 5, where we are going to look at both forensics and physical evidence. So this will definitely be a two-parter. We have a lot of content to cover. Please take the time to read your textbook as well in order to kind of fill in some of those spots that maybe I can't get to. So I'll try my best to fit it all in our two-parter, but we'll see how it goes. So let's go ahead and jump right into this week's lecture. So the evolution of law enforcement has benefited greatly from forensic science, and for the subject forensic science dates back to about 1910 and something called the exchange principle that was set forth by a French criminologist by the name of Edmond Locard. And the primary purpose of an investigation is to locate, identify, and preserve evidence. But it's really not that simple, and you'll start to see how technical it can actually be as we work our way not only through this chapter, but through other chapters. So with that said, evidence is generally categorized as one of four different types. And think about it for a second before I throw those up on the screen. What might the four types be? So to kind of help you out, so we have testimonial, we have documentary, demonstrative, and physical. And we're going to look at each one of these briefly individually to give you a better idea about what they actually represent. So first of all, testimonial evidence is information obtained through interviewing and interrogating individuals about what they saw, maybe eyewitness evidence, or what they heard, which might be here. You'll learn the term hearsay evidence, but what people have heard, or actually what they know, which might even be described as character evidence. But testimonial evidence, it kind of goes along with the word. It's the testimony, it's the spoken word, it's information that you are able to get or obtain through interviewing and interrogating. Now, documentary evidence typically includes things like written materials. It would also include emails or text messages, any type of audio recording, or any video. So a couple of examples you can see in the one on the left at the bottom of the screen, a forged check. That would be a piece of documentary evidence. And next we have what we call demonstrative evidence. And this includes things like mock-ups or scale models of certain objects or places related to the crime scene. And these mock-ups or these scale models will help the jury visualize more clearly what they are unable to view personally. Meaning that because not every jury can travel out to a crime scene, the mock-up or this scale model will actually help add some perspective. And some of these mock-ups or these scale models can be extremely cool, meaning they're not only digital, but they can show, trajectory of bullets. They can show, square footage or distance. They can even animate these mock-ups. So you could have an animation of a shooting. Let's say it took place at a bar or something like that, and how it actually occurred. So you could recreate it for the jury. So these are very instrumental pieces of evidence. And here's kind of a larger view of a couple of different mock-ups, where again you could see how these, and there are special software programs that law enforcement agencies have that once you get trained up in how to use them, you can create these type of mock-ups. So the most common type of evidence that investigators will deal with is going to be physical evidence. Now, physical evidence is anything real, that is, which has a substance that helps establish the facts of a case. And it can be seen, touched, smelled, or tasted. And I'm not really sure what the taste part, how to kind of fit that in, but it does fall within the definition of physical evidence. And also keep in mind that it may be right there at the crime scene, or it could be miles away, or it may even be on the suspect or the victim. And, moreover, it may actually tie one crime to a similar crime. And it may also provide new leads. So this evidence, and physical evidence is kind of where the last one that we were talking about. Again, it could be right there at the crime scene. It could be around the corner. As the suspect ran, he threw the gun and he's already a block away. Or it may be on the suspect. It might be on the victim. The interesting thing when you are trying to link crimes together, some evidence that you find may tie one crime to another crime that occurred. So you're figuring out that it might be the same individual committing these crimes. Or it may in fact provide a whole new lead. So to give you just a quick example of physical evidence, it could be, and we're looking here in the upper left, it could be a handgun that was used in a homicide. It could be simply blood spatter on the ground. It could be a rope that was used to bind someone. It could be tire tracks, or it could be this shotgun shell. So a lot of different things that are, when you look at physical evidence, there's a lot of different possibilities out there. When you look at this particular scene, take a look at it for a second. And as you look further, decide what you think evidence, what should we take as evidence? What might be important? What could we find some fingerprints on? What could we find? I'm going to let you kind of decide for a minute, but take a look at what's there. And tell me what you might want to collect as evidence. The same with this scene, and I know the pictures are gory, but this is a criminal investigation course. What would be of any type of evidentiary value in a scene like this? Sometimes there's not that much evidence, and you're just left with maybe the victim themselves and whatever's there. But could there be tire tracks there, or some other type of evidence that you would collect? If it's in a house, as opposed to what you saw here in maybe an open area, but isolated perhaps into one room. Again, I just need you to kind of start thinking of what might be of evidentiary value. In the last chapter, we talked about how to conduct an investigation. Well, and where to look. You can see on the back here, on the what looks to be the dryer, you can see some spatter here. But could there be spatter up here? Could there be spatter up on the roof? Is there a big pool down below his head right there to indicate that was the last place that he was at, or the position he was in before he died? I mean, so all of these things are things that you need to consider. And again, gory photos, but I want you to understand, when you are a criminal investigator, these are the types of things that you're going to have to deal with. This photo actually goes along with this particular crime scene right here, in looking at what you might have as evidence. Shell casings that are marked by the placards right here, the actual victim themselves. You can see a bullet strike up here. So again, you have to kind of broaden things out and really look in order to make sure that you're capturing all the evidence possible. Okay, so physical evidence can be classified in different ways. So we know the different types of evidence, basically. But now let's kind of look at how physical evidence can be classified. So one common classification is what we call direct and indirect evidence. So direct evidence establishes proof of a fact without any other type of evidence, with nothing else. And indirect evidence merely tends to incriminate a person. So does that kind of make sense? So let's look at an example of indirect. A suspect's footprint is found at the scene. Now, although the footprints do not directly show that the suspect committed the crime, the footprints do at least place the suspect at the scene of the crime, which tends to incriminate them, right? So again, direct evidence establishes proof of fact without any other evidence. Indirect, on the other hand, merely tends to incriminate a person. So that's kind of, so there's a couple of important definitions to understand. And that's why you need to be objective. One of those characteristics that we spoke of a good investigator. Now, indirect evidence is also referred to or called circumstantial evidence, or evidence from which inferences are drawn. Now, there is a popular myth out there that circumstantial evidence will not stand alone without other facts to support it in court. However, indirect evidence combined with suspect interviews and, let's say, other testimonial evidence can actually lead to convictions. So, you can make a case on just circumstantial evidence, but there has to be a little bit more to go with it. You just need to know that indirect evidence is also referred to as circumstantial. And the reason would be because you're drawing an inference from it. So what is an inference? Which is why I have the little question mark right there. And I'll give you a second to kind of think about that. So an inference, you come around the corner and you see somebody standing over a body holding the smoking gun. If you did not see the person shoot the person, you're going to have to draw an inference from a set of facts. The fact the person is standing next to the victim, the fact that the gun is still smoking, the fact that the person on the ground is bleeding from a gunshot wound, the fact that maybe there's nobody else around. Those are inferences based on, and you have facts that help you build that inference. And it's kind of circumstantial, even though you're probably sure that the guy pulled the trigger. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. Here's another inference, albeit kind of funny. So this fox kills the chicken, but you didn't see it. You come around the corner and all you see is the feathers in the fox's mouth. So can you actually say factually that the fox killed the chicken? It's kind of a dorky picture, but the answer is going to be no. You can draw a very strong inference because the chicken's dead right there. The fox is looking at you and he's got like a bunch of feathers in his mouth, which would lead you to believe that he killed the chicken. But you may have to have some other information or some other evidence. So again, that's what inference kind of refers to. So we've kind of tied that in with circumstantial evidence. Okay, so extremely small items, such as things like hairs or fibers, are a subset of direct evidence called trace evidence. And evidence established by law is called prima facie evidence. So again, small items, hairs, fibers, those are a subset of direct evidence. And we call that trace evidence because it's so small. You're going to have to look closely or use alternative lighting or some other source to help you find it. And again, evidence established by law is called prima facie evidence, or facie, depends how you kind of pronounce it. But an example of that would be for, a 0.08 ethanol alcohol in the blood of an individual is direct or prima facie evidence of intoxication? So I mean, it depends what state you're in, but but again, if a person if 0.08 is the legal limit, and you give the machine to the person and they blow in it, that really is, and it's a 0.08 or higher, then you have some prima facie evidence that the individual is in fact intoxicated because it's established by law. All right, so hopefully that kind of clears that up a little bit. And sometimes I know that it's a little, some of these legalese terms are a little technical. Okay, and a couple of other definitions of different types of evidence. So we have what we would call associative evidence. And this is evidence that links a suspect with the crime. We have what we call corpus delicti evidence, and this type of evidence establishes that a crime has actually been committed. Corpus delicti is kind of a funky word. It literally means the body of the crime, but it doesn't mean the body. It means the body, the elements of the crime. So in order to establish a crime, you have to establish the corpus delicti, if that kind of makes sense. And then we have probative evidence. This is evidence that tends to prove guilt or innocence. So these are just, again, definitions that are very helpful for you to learn. We have exculpatory evidence. This is the type of evidence that might clear somebody from blame. We have material evidence, which is evidence that has a legitimate and effective influence on a case. Therefore, it's material. We have relevant evidence, which means that evidence that applies to the matter in question, whatever that question might be. And then we have competent evidence, which has been properly collected, identified, and secured, which means that the chain of custody has continued, and therefore they call it competent because it's been properly collected, identified, and continuously secured via chain of custody, etc. All right, so a lot of definitions. So now let's start to talk a little bit more about crime scene investigations. So a crime scene investigator, or CSI, by definition, if you will, is a specialist in organized scientific collection and processing of evidence. A CSI develops, processes, and packages all physical evidence found at a crime scene and later transports it to the lab for forensic evaluation. Also attends and documents autopsies and writes reports and testifies in court about that evidence that they may have located, processed, collected, marked, and placed into property, etc. Now, the public has become very familiar with how CSIs, if you will, operate through a popular TV series called CSI Crime Scene Investigation, which I believe it first aired on CBS back in October of 2000. But anyway, this show has attracted millions of viewers and has spawned dozens of other forensic drama TV shows. Now, Hollywood's depiction of CSI, however, has kind of created a glamorized, almost an impractical image of this field in the public's mind. And this phenomenon has been called the CSI effect, where there are just basically unrealistic portrayals of the science that have translated equally into unrealistic expectations from not only the public, but also other professions that operate within the justice system. Meaning, like, why can't we do what they do on TV? When you watch this particular show, they're called to a crime scene, they collect the evidence, they interview people, they find their suspects, they might even get in some type of gunfight and chase and this and that, and they go to the autopsy and they do all this stuff, and it's done in like 42 minutes. minus commercials. But it's not like that. And some of the technology that they show, we have some, but we don't have some of the other technology that they have. So just kind of keep that in mind. So the challenge of the CSI effect for investigators and forensic experts alike are being brought to life when we go to court. Because people who end up on a jury, they know, or they think they know a great deal about forensic science because they've seen it on TV, but they really don't. And prosecutors say that juries now expect some scientific evidence in every case, even though the majority of criminal cases really don't have or call for this type of evidence. So it is an interesting phenomenon when you kind of look at it. So again, these are unrealistic portrayals of the science that have kind of translated, to equally unrealistic expectations from the public. And we talked a little bit about some of the challenges. Now on page 135 in your textbook, down at the bottom right-hand corner, it talks about the CSI effect a little bit more, and a study that was published in the National Institute of Justice Journal back in 2008. And in this information, we see that 1,000 jurors were surveyed about their expectations regarding forensic evidence before they participated in the trial. And a couple of interesting things. 46% expected to see scientific evidence in every criminal case. 22% expected to see DNA in every criminal case. 36% expected to see fingerprints in every criminal case. And the survey found that for all categories of evidence, these CSI viewers had higher expectations for scientific evidence than the non-viewers. So a follow-up study conducted in 2009 indicated some higher levels. 58.3% of potential jurors expected some type of scientific evidence to be presented, which is up from 46%. 42.1% expected DNA evidence in every case. That's double the number in the 2008 report. Isn't that kind of crazy? 56.5% expected fingerprint evidence in every single case. And then 49.1% expected ballistic evidence in every single case. So it is kind of real. So we have to really kind of, understand that. Now, furthermore, these studies revealed that while the average juror has become increasingly technologically sophisticated, their expanded familiarity with technology is more likely due to the general persuasiveness or pervasiveness, if you will, of and exposure to consumer level technology, including the ability to search the internet for information pertaining to scientific evidence. That is the result of watching certain TV shows like we talked about. And this finding has led to the identification of a kind of a more general effect. It's called the tech effect, which is a broad public awareness of and familiarity with the capabilities of modern technology that is indirectly influencing juror expectations. So you can see that now, even with this tech effect, we have more that we have to kind of think about, or the public expects a little bit more, and that influences our jury pool. So what about the equipment? So we've talked a little bit about the different types of evidence and some things to kind of pay attention to. So let's take a quick look at equipment, and we're not going to go through all of it because we just don't have time. But although not all crime scenes require all items of equipment, you really can't predict the nature of the next crime that's going to be committed. So with that said, you really should have available at all times some type of crime scene investigation kit, at least containing some basic equipment. And you're going to want to check the kit's equipment after each use, of course, and replace those items that are typically required. Now, investigations, again, they can be simple or complex, and they can reveal little or a lot of physical evidence. So consequently, the equipment needs of each investigation might be different. Now, in your textbook on page 137 is a laundry list of things when it comes to processing a crime scene, and there's a lot, too much for me to actually share. So if you really want to know what you should carry, I would suggest that you look on that page. Now, most officers, our patrol officers, I know they carry fingerprint kits, so they can dust for prints. They carry a camera, so they can take photos. They carry certain different shapes of, let's say, property bags, evidence bags. They also have little containers in case the evidence is of a liquid form. If they need more, they can call for, and a lot of departments have crime scene technicians. These are the CSIs that we talk about that will come out and actually collect that evidence and process it. And they'll come out in a truck or a van that has all of this other equipment. So just consider that as we kind of continue. But let's look at 4 really quick areas as it relates to investigative equipment. So the first would be selecting. So you need to survey the types of crimes and evidence most frequently found at scenes in your jurisdictions. And then select equipment to process and preserve that type of evidence that you're most likely to encounter. So like I said before, for example, because fingerprints are often found at crime scenes, having a fingerprint processing kit or equipment should be included. The same with a camera. The same with maybe a roll-a-tape, which is a tape measure, which you can put on the ground. It has a long handle, and you can measure from point A to point B. Evidence bags, evidence containers, things like that. And if you need more, you can always call for different things. And talking about containers, the equipment can, be put into one container or divided into several based on the frequency of the use. And we're talking about the kit. And this is also an administrative decision determined by each department's needs. Dividing equipment results in compact, lightweight kits suitable for most crime scenes while ensuring the availability of other equipment for those less common cases. So that's what we did when I was in the city of Rialto. Every patrol officer would carry like a little crime scene kit with a camera, evidence bags, little containers for anything liquid, a fingerprint kit, a roll-a-tape, and different things. And if we needed more, we could roll a supervisor out with more equipment, or we could roll out the crime scene tech and they would come out and process that for us. So again, it's just kind of determining what you need. And as it relates to transporting equipment, well, crime scene investigative equipment is typically transported in a police vehicle. Our officers would keep it in the trunk of their car, typically. And, again, the equipment can be transported in the trunk of the car, or a vehicle can be modified to carry it. So it might have some special racks or a special pit area in the trunk where you can put it, or even in the rear seat where you can install a special place to put some of this things. A lot of times there's a mobile crime scene lab. And that's what we had when I worked in Rialto. We had a mobile crime scene vehicle that was a commercial van that was customized, that had a bunch of compartments, and you could even put things inside there that you would need refrigerated. So it had everything that you would need to process a crime scene in the van, and the tech would bring the van out. So again, most patrol officers just have the little kit, and the crime scene techs will have the larger kits or vehicle. Now, one of the more important things before we move on would be making sure that you're trained in the use of the equipment that you have. So one of the largest failures in gathering evidence, not locating, but gathering, is not the equipment being available or something like that, but it's the lack of training to use it effectively. So each officer should really understand the use and operation of each item of equipment, and that's why a lot of times we'll have experts, the CSIs, do it. But experience also comes with doing it. So whether it's refresher training or going out and doing some mock crime scenes and taking some photos and having them looked at by the crime scene tech, or practicing your fingerprinting, which I've seen officers do. So that way when they're out there at a real crime scene, there's a better chance that they will be successful in processing some of those low-grade crime scenes, if you will. All right, so let's talk a little bit now about crime scene integrity and contamination of evidence. So the value of evidence is directly affected by what happens immediately following the crime. Evidence in an unprotected crime scene is going to degrade, it's going to diminish, or it's going to disappear over time unless somebody collects it and then it's properly preserved. Now, contamination occurs when anything is introduced into the scene that was not there originally. So once again, when anything is introduced to the scene that was not there originally, that would be contamination. And in fact, most contamination ends up being caused by those who are investigating the crime scene. So to minimize contamination of a crime scene and the evidence within, we're going to cordon off the area. Maybe you've seen crime scene tape. So we're going to rope that area off and keep all unnecessary individuals out, including those police officers that don't belong in there. So they'll be outside of that scene perimeter. And any law enforcement officers that are not assigned to the crime who walk through the scene out of curiosity, they can really obliterate clues and actually add trace evidence. So we have to be very careful. Now, another important step to minimize contamination is for all personnel processing the scene to wear protective clothing. And maybe you've seen those evidence techs in those like paper-looking suits. So this includes Tyvek suits that cover the head, disposable gloves, and shoe booties, and other protective gear that helps keep fibers or hair or dirt or anything else present on your clothing, the investigator's clothing, from falling off and landing in the crime scene. And that includes the two big no-nos that I'll throw out there. And you think I'm crazy, but I'm not. That includes chewing sunflower seeds or bubble gum or gum. Because where are you going to spit those seeds? And where are you going to spit that gum? So think about it. These are things, that we kind of don't really think about. And as funny as it sounds, it's actually, we've seen that happen. So, all right, so we know what contamination is. So we need to take extreme care to avoid what we call cross-contamination. And that is allowing items to touch one another. And that's the reason, so allowing items to touch one another and thus exchange matter. So if they were to touch each other, they're going to exchange something between the two items. So that's the reason that we bag all of our items separately, to prevent any transfer of materials between them. And you might think, God, that's crazy. You mean if I have 3 shell casings, I can't put them in the same little envelope? The answer is no, you can't. You put them in separate envelopes until they're processed. And that way you keep any, because somebody may have touched one of those. So it kind of makes sense. So if you have bloody clothes, a bloody shirt, and a bloody pair of pants, you don't put them in the same bag. You put them in separate bags. So hopefully that kind of makes sense, because you don't want things to touch. You want things to stay as separate as possible, because we want to avoid this thing called cross-contamination, which is when they actually touch each other. Okay, and so here's kind of a quick visual. So you can look at this horrible job that's done where shoes are sticking out. You see a piece of a shirt sticking out, and all of this evidence is packaged and thrown into this box. Is there a possibility for some type of cross-contamination? The answer is yes. So this is a really good example of a bad example. If you were to package, I mean, think about this. There are certain packaging boxes. So for firearms, knives, and other sharp objects, we have special boxes we can put them into. But again, you're going to want to package everything separately. And when the techs come out, again, they'll process it. They may even take a little sample of blood off of the knife before they bag it and tag it up, but just showing you some different pieces of evidence. Same with a cigarette. Is there some valuable evidence on this? There is, because if you look at the end of it, hopefully you can see the lipstick, which means that could you maybe get some DNA? It's very, very possible. So you don't want to contaminate that by packaging the knife and the cigarette together. So again, but I'm just kind of showing you some examples of different types of evidence. Here's the suit I was talking about. Now, depending upon the type of crime scene, if it's a simple burglary and somebody pushed a door in and took a television set, you don't have to wear the entire suit. But on some of these more serious and sophisticated crime scenes, you are definitely going to want to wear one of these so you don't add anything in to that crime scene that might contaminate it. Okay, so we also want to make sure that evidence does not lose its value. And when we say value, we mean its integrity because of a contaminated crime scene. So the phrase integrity of evidence refers to the requirement that any item introduced in court must be in the same condition as when it was found. So hopefully that makes sense. So the bloody knife that we saw, you're not going to want to take a blood sample from the knife and then go, okay, we can, and then wash off the rest of the knife and then package the knife. When it goes to court, that integrity of evidence means that the court's going to want to see that in as much of the same condition as when it was found. And part of making sure that happens is through something called chain of evidence. So the chain of evidence is, or chain of custody, documents what happened to the evidence from the time it was found to the time that it gets to court. And that's really important. And that's going to include every single person, everyone who has taken custody of that piece of evidence. And again, why do you think that's important? Because we want to document the chain of custody to ensure that the evidence has not been tampered with, that there's not a big gap in there and we can't account for a day, let's say, on where that knife was. So that's the rationale for having the chain of custody or that chain of evidence. So again, I hope that kind of makes sense. And here's an example looking at an envelope. So if we were to put some evidence inside one of these evidence, in the middle is an evidence tag. So these are tags, and sometimes they're envelopes, but they look the same. But you're gonna see the chain here. Received from, received by, the date, time, and it goes all the way down. So you may be the first one to book it. So here, submitting agency, case number, item number, the date, collected by, the badge number. Okay. And then if, again, chain of custody would be if someone looks at that evidence, takes it to the lab, and it's different than this person, you're gonna mark this chain of custody. Again, to make sure that everybody who has touched the evidence or handled it or moved it is documented. Here again, you have the submitting agency's information and the chain of custody documented here. So this would be an evidence tag or an envelope, and they're marked basically the same way. Okay, so during a crime scene search, and we're going to talk a little bit about, actually discovering and recognizing evidence, if you will. So during a crime scene search, it is often difficult to determine immediately what is or might be evidence. Now, numerous objects are usually present, but they're not all evidence. So, kind of think about what you might take. And how would you maybe decide that? And these are going to be, they're going to be decisions that you're going to have to make there. So to determine what is evidence, consider the crime type. Then look for any objects unrelated or foreign to the scene, unusual in location or number, or things that might be damaged or broken, or those things whose relation to other objects suggests a pattern that kind of fits the crime. So again, if it's a burglary, you want to look for certain types of evidence. If it's a robbery, maybe certain types. But you're going to have to, you first want to consider the crime type, but then be open enough to consider and look at all the objects. Look for any objects foreign to the scene, like maybe a pair of glasses just sitting on the floor in the middle of a room. That's kind of not normal. It's kind of foreign to the scene. Or unusual in location, like in the picture in the right here. So this is the photo of the O.J. Simpson crime scene where they found a bloody glove on a walkway. Now, that's kind of, it kind of sticks out, right? It's a little unusual in location. Or things that might be damaged or broken, figuring that maybe they were damaged and broken as a result of the crime. So hopefully that kind of makes a little bit of sense. So with all of that said, logic and experience are going to help you determine the value of evidence. And again, evidence in its original state is a lot more valuable than altered or damaged evidence. So just keep all that in mind as we talk a lot more about evidence, etc. So also consider that probabilities play a large role in determining the value of evidence. And fingerprints and DNA provide positive identification. Now, in contrast, blood types do not provide positive identification, but they can help eliminate a potential suspect. But, fingerprints can actually identify somebody specifically, and DNA can provide quite a bit of information on an individual. So these are important things to remember as you're looking at what type of evidence is there. But again, blood type doesn't give you a positive ID, but it can help you eliminate a possible suspect if the blood type you found was, let's say, O positive, and the person that you think may be involved in the crime was A, or something like that. So, just kind of consider that as you're dealing with your investigative responsibilities. Now, an object's individuality is also very, very important. Some objects have identification marks on them, and others require a comparison to be made. And think about that. Again, an object's individuality is important. For example, a heel mark's value is directly proportional to the number of its specific features, such as brand name or number of nails in the heel, and the individual wear patterns that can be identified. And then some objects, again, have identification marks on them. And others, evidence, requires a comparison to be of any type of value. So a tire impression, for instance, matching a tire, a bullet matching a specific revolver, a torn piece of clothing matching a shirt, you're going to need some type of comparison. So a standard of comparison then is an object, measure, or model with which evidence is compared to determine whether they both came from the same source. Now, fingerprints are the most familiar example of evidence requiring a standard of comparison, right? A fingerprint found at a crime scene must be matched with a known print in order to be of value, right? So if you find something at a crime scene, it doesn't do you any good unless you can match it up. Otherwise, it's just an unknown fingerprint. So, I mean, does that kind of make sense? And likewise, a piece of glass may be found in a suspect's coat can be compared with glass collected from, let's say, a window pane broken during a burglary. And sometimes it's even how an object fits with the surroundings determines whether it's likely to be evidence. So you have to kind of look at the whole thing. And here's a great example. Again, fingerprints are kind of the one thing. So now, once evidence is discovered, you're going to want to place an evidence marker next to it. And these usually come, you've seen them, they're those little yellow plates kind of looking things. And they come in either alpha, meaning letter, or numeric versions. And some have a little ruler on them to add some size context. You're going to record the item on an evidence log. And you're going to photograph and then sketch before you collect or move it. So remember I told you that actually processing a crime scene can be a little bit technical. And if you wondered, God, do they still do sketches? The answer is yes. So again, it's important that you follow all of these steps. And you're going to want to do all of this stuff before you remove it from the scene. Because once you remove it, you can't go, oh, God, I forgot to do this, and the sketch, and then take it and put it back. That would be completely inappropriate, so you can see why. So here's an example of a couple of crime scene photos. And you can see the different placards. And, of course, the size of the crime scene is going to dictate. And, again, there's even variations. So here they have the placard, and then they have a little pointer, and it points to the casing. So that way, when the person is taking the photos or whoever's looking at the photograph, and they're going to come by and they're going to take a picture. Now, they're going to take a big picture of everything in the scene, and then they're going to do individual shots. So hopefully that kind of helps there. And then look at this crime scene. Imagine having to process this crime scene. Here they had several crime scene techs and investigators working together. This is the terrorist incident, the aftermath of the shooting that took place that killed the 2 local terrorists. This happened a couple years ago in the city of San Bernardino. So, and you can see the placards and the clothing and all the other stuff. So a lot of these scenes can be very, very big. So again, so now as it relates to, let's say, marking, identifying, and collecting evidence. So once discovered, again, you're going to want to place an evidence marker next to it. And again, they come in these different, they're either numbered or lettered. You're going to record the item on an evidence log. You're going to, listing the marker or number that's placed by it for identification. Then you're going to photograph it. And you're going to sketch it before collecting or otherwise moving it. Make sure you mark, log, and photograph and collect all of the objects that are or may be evidence, leaving the final decision regarding relevance to the prosecutor. Meaning it's better to take a little bit more than to not take enough. Now, be sure to, collect an adequate amount of the sample. If you're going to take a sample of something, and to obtain standards of comparison if necessary. And now you're going to mark all the evidence as collected or received. And there are some common errors. So common errors when it comes to collecting evidence would be not collecting enough, as I said a minute ago, not obtaining standards of comparison, or simply not maintaining the integrity of the process. Do not alter, change, or destroy evidence, or reduce its value by the identification marking. So don't, if you have something, don't draw a big, take one of those big fatty black markers that won't erase, and mark across the middle of something. So sometimes you may want to put an evidence tag that has a little clip, let's say, on it, so you're not damaging the actual piece of evidence itself. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. So you have to be smart about how you're going to do this. So again, mark, identify each item of evidence in the way it can be remembered. Record in your notes the date, time, the location, recovered by who, and who took custody of it. So here's a standard evidence envelope, and you can see some of the information at once, the location of it's got the chain of possession right here, the description of the evidence. Here's an evidence bag, and you can see that they put a barcode tag here, and they've initialed the fact that it's been sealed shut. But these are all important things to do as you package evidence. So careful packaging maintains the evidence in its original state, preventing damage or contamination, and we've talked about that. Package each item separately. Don't mix them or cross-contaminate. Note the specific requirements for the type of evidence, like liquid, or if it's a little piece of hair or a firearm. You have different evidence container types for those different items. Consider, we know that packaging is extremely important, so consider both plastic and paper forms of packaging, and what you may want to put in a plastic bag or what you may want to put in a paper bag. And then preserve evidence. What about immovable objects like a door frame? So look at the upper right picture. What would you do with that? The actual door piece right here. So you're an investigator and it's a high profile burglary case, and these are your marks, and you want these marks, and you photograph them, you take an impression. Can you take the plate? You actually could. You could take the plate if you believed that you needed it, and it may not be a bad idea, because you're not going to cut the door frame out, but you could actually remove this plate and take that and have it analyzed at the lab. Same with windows. Now here you're not going to get a glass cutter and cut the glass out, but perhaps you're going to want to at least dust the windows for fingerprints or any other type of available evidence. If it's maybe a bullet hole in a door, if you really need it, you could take the door, or you could photograph it, and different things. So you have to, again, it's discretionary, but you have to think about how you're going to package it. Now we'll finish up this part one section talking about a couple of other real quick things. So transporting evidence. So if the crime lab is nearby, an officer can deliver the evidence personally, but typically they don't do that. A lot of times the way it really works in the real world is the officer will collect evidence. If there's no crime scene tech, they'll take it to the property room and they'll book it, and then the evidence tech the next day when they come in, they will properly process and transport that evidence to the lab, keeping, of course, the chain of custody. But you could, if it's a small amount of evidence, you could deliver the evidence personally. But again, typically it's a crime scene tech that will do it. So again, how evidence should be transported depends on the size and the type, and the distance as well. But it says to use the fastest method possible or available, but we typically would have our crime scene investigator handle all of the transporting of the evidence to the lab, and if need be, assisted by an investigator. Okay, so how do we protect evidence? So we're gonna hit this section, and then we're gonna be done for part one. So we're gonna talk about protecting, storing, and managing. So before, during, and after its examination, evidence is going to need to be secured, protected, properly stored, and actually managed. And securing and storing and tracking evidence is no small task, because each article needs to be accounted for at all times. So physical evidence is subject to chemical change, negligence, accident, intentional damage, theft, alterations during handling, etc. So with proper storage, however, most of these issues can be prevented. And again, the storage must be secure, well organized, and free from heat or moisture. And some things like bloody clothing, they may have to go into a special drying room. And you're going to need to dry the clothing before you can actually package it up and take it to the lab for analysis. So it's evident, storing evidence is a lot more difficult. So just quickly, a couple of examples of evidence rooms. And you'll see that some of them are pretty well organized. And you can find things. And some of them are a shambles. Look at this mess. You have all these firearms just thrown into this pit, and all of this junk evidence here, and all of this. This is a completely unacceptable evidence room. And I'm hoping that you can see why. Now look at this one. This room is good. It's got stolen and recovered bicycles here on these racks, and everything is boxed and tagged or tubbed up and shelved in a filing system. And this is like awesome. And sometimes you will get individuals that will come down from the state to look at your evidence room to make sure that you are complying with state standards. So it's important that you keep your evidence properly secured. And this is a great example of how an evidence room should look. Here's another one. You can find everything in here. Everything is organized. It's on racks. It's lettered and numbered, and what a nice looking clean evidence room. Okay, so this would be a really good place to stop. We're going to stop right about now. When we come back for part two, we'll talk a little bit about how we're going to present evidence in court. So this will conclude part one of chapter 5, discussing forensics and physical evidence.